I stood on the lawn of my childhood home, the cold metal of the sheriff's handcuffs inches from my wrists. My father was barely gone, and my stepmother was already smiling, clutching a forged deed to steal everything. Have you ever been deeply betrayed by someone who was supposed to be mourning alongside you? Share your own experiences in the comments below, and please, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to hear how I thought back. But to understand how a black helicopter became my only salvation, we have to go back to the beginning, to the day my nightmare truly started. The Texas sun beat down on the dry earth, but I felt nothing but a hollow, freezing numbness inside. It had only been 48 hours since we laid my father to rest. He was the anchor of this 5,000-acre ranch, a man whose hands were as weathered as the fences he built. I stood on the wraparound porch, clutching his favorite Stetson to my chest, trying to inhale the fading scent of leather and peppermint. This ranch was my childhood, my entire world. But the sanctuary of my grief was shattered the moment Elaine, my stepmother of merely 3 years, walked out of the house. Gone was the weeping, devoted widow who had leaned on my shoulder at the funeral. Instead, she wore a sharp designer suit and a cold, calculating glare that made my stomach twist. "You need to start packing, Clara," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. I blinked, the words struggling to make sense through my haze of sorrow. "Packing? Elaine, what are you talking about? Dad just passed. We need to focus on the estate, the horses." "There is no we anymore, sweetheart," she interrupted, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. She pulled a crisp, folded document from her letter portfolio. "Your father made his choices before his heart gave out. The ranch, the livestock, and the newly discovered oil rights, they all belong to me now, exclusively." Dad would never do that. We had spent countless evenings poring over maps, planning the future of the ranch together. This was my legacy. Something was terribly wrong, and as I looked into Elaine's icy eyes, I realized my nightmare was only just beginning. My hands trembled as I reached for the document. "Let me see that," I demanded, my voice cracking under the weight of my rising panic. Elaine didn't hand it over. She simply held it up, keeping it just out of my reach. I strained to read the text. There, at the bottom of the page, was my father's signature, or at least an incredibly convincing imitation of it. But I knew his handwriting better than I knew my own. The loop on the D was too sharp, the pressure too even for a man whose arthritis had flared up terribly in his final months. "This is a forgery," I whispered, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. "Dad could barely hold a pen last month, Elaine. There's no way he signed a complete transfer of the deed and the oil rights to you." Elaine laughed, a sharp, dismissive sound that echoed across the quiet porch. "Grief is making you delusional, Clara. It was notarized by my personal attorney. Everything is perfectly legal and perfectly mine." "I won't let you do this," I said, stepping forward. Tears of frustration blurred my vision. "This ranch has been in our family for 4 generations. He promised me half, and you know it. You're trying to steal my home." "It ceased being your home the second his heart stopped," she replied, her tone turning venomous. "I'm giving you 1 hour to gather your clothes and leave the property. If you take anything of value, I will have you charged with theft." "I'm not going anywhere." I stood my ground, clutching the porch rail. "This is my house." Elaine pulled out her phone, her eyes narrowing. "We'll see about that." The next 45 minutes passed in a suffocating blur of agonizing tension. I retreated to the kitchen, pacing the worn hardwood floors, desperately trying to reach our longtime family lawyer, but every call went straight to voicemail. I felt entirely isolated, trapped in the very home that had always been my safe haven. Then, the crunch of heavy tires on the gravel driveway shattered the silence. I rushed to the window and felt my blood run cold. It wasn't a friend or a neighbor coming to offer condolences. It was a white patrol car with the county sheriff's emblem emblazoned on the side.
Elaine was already waiting for them on the front lawn, putting on a masterful performance. I watched as she dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue, pointing a trembling finger toward the house. I stepped out onto the porch, my legs feeling like lead. Sheriff Davis, a man who had known me since I was a little girl in pigtails, walked toward me with a heavy sigh and a deeply conflicted expression. "Clara, I'm so sorry about your daddy," he started, tipping his hat. "But Mrs. Elaine here has shown me the paperwork. She's the sole legal owner of this property now." "Sheriff, that paper is fake," I pleaded, my voice echoing across the yard. "You know, Dad. You know he wouldn't leave me with nothing." "I can't judge the paperwork, Clara. That's for a civil court to decide," he said softly, reaching for the cuffs on his belt. "Right now, she wants you removed." "If you don't leave willingly, she's pressing charges for trespassing. I have to ask you to turn around and put your hands behind your back." The metallic clink of the handcuffs seemed deafening in the quiet Texas afternoon. I couldn't believe this was happening. My father's body was barely cold, and I was being arrested on the front lawn of the only home I had ever known. Tears finally spilled over my cheeks, blurring the triumphant, vicious smiles spreading across Elaine's face. "I'm sorry, Clara," Sheriff Davis murmured, stepping closer and gently taking my wrist. "Just come quietly. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." Before he could secure the metal around my wrists, a low, rhythmic thumping echoed in the distance. The sound grew rapidly, a deep vibration that rattled the window panes of the ranch house and stirred the dust on the driveway. We all looked up as a massive, sleek black helicopter broke through the clouds, descending rapidly toward the sprawling front lawn. The sheer force of the rotor wash sent the sheriff stumbling backward and whipped my hair wildly around my face. Elaine shrieked, shielding her eyes and taking several steps back toward the porch to avoid the flying debris. The aircraft touched down flawlessly on the grass, the engine whining as the blades began to slow. The side door slid open. Elaine lowered her hands, her triumphant smile vanishing instantly. Her face drained of all color, transforming into a mask of pure, unadulterated terror. She froze completely, her jaw slack, as if she had just seen a ghost. I squinted against the fading wind, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had no idea who would arrive in such a dramatic fashion, but seeing Elaine's terrified reaction gave me a sudden, desperate spark of hope. Someone was here. A pair of polished boots stepped onto the grass, followed by a tall, impeccably dressed man in a tailored charcoal suit. As he stood up to his full height, adjusting his silver-tipped cane, I gasped. It was Uncle Harrison, my father's estranged older brother, the billionaire oil magnate who had left Texas 30 years ago over a bitter family dispute. I hadn't seen him since I was 10 years old, but his sharp, piercing blue eyes, so achingly similar to my father's, were unmistakable. He didn't look like a man here to mourn. He looked like a man here for war. "Sheriff Davis!" Uncle Harrison's voice boomed over the dying whine of the helicopter engine, radiating absolute authority. "I suggest you put those handcuffs away, unless you plan on using them on the woman standing on the porch." The sheriff froze, his eyes wide. "Mr. Harrison, sir, I have a signed deed here." "You have a piece of fiction," Harrison interrupted smoothly, walking straight toward Elaine. She was shaking now, her designer portfolio clutched to her chest like a shield. You can't be here," Elaine stammered, her voice high and breathless with panic. "The estate is mine." Uncle Harrison stopped a few feet from her, his expression colder than ice. "Did you really think my brother and I didn't speak, Elaine? We reconciled 5 years ago, and he knew exactly what you were." That's why he placed the ranch, the oil rights, and everything else into an irrevocable family trust. He turned his gaze to me, his stern features softening just a fraction. A trust of which Clara is the sole beneficiary, and I am the executor. The handcuffs slipped from the sheriff's grasp. The heavy silence that followed Uncle Harrison's declaration was so profound I could hear the wind rustling through the pecan trees. I stood frozen on the porch, my father's Stetson still pressed against my chest, struggling to process the monumental shift in my reality.
Elaine's confident facade had completely shattered, leaving behind a pale, trembling shadow of the woman who had tried to cast me out mere moments ago. Uncle Harrison calmly unbuttoned his suit jacket and produced a thick, embossed envelope. He handed it directly to Sheriff Davis. Here is the certified copy of the irrevocable trust, established 3 years ago.
Furthermore, there is a legal injunction prohibiting Elaine from accessing any of my late brother's financial assets or properties. Her forged deed is not only legally void, but it constitutes felony fraud. Sheriff Davis adjusted his glasses, scanning the heavy legal document. I watched his posture shift from apologetic enforcement to stern realization.
He let out a long breath, handing the papers back to my uncle before turning a hard glare on my stepmother. "Mrs. Elaine," the sheriff said, his voice dropping an octave, "it appears I was about to arrest the wrong woman today. You lied to me, and you attempted to use my office to illegally evict the rightful owner of this ranch." "No, you don't understand."
"Elaine!" cried out, her voice pitching into a desperate whine. She looked around frantically, playing the victim. "He was my husband. He loved me. Harrison is lying. He always hated our marriage. Clara manipulated him." I finally found my voice, stepping off the porch. "Dad loved this ranch, Elaine, and he clearly knew you loved his bank account more than you ever loved him."
Tears streamed down Elaine's face, but they elicited no sympathy from anyone standing on the lawn. It was a stark contrast to the genuine gut-wrenching sorrow I had been drowning in for the past 2 days. Her tears were born of panic, not grief. She lunged forward, trying to grab the envelope from Uncle Harrison's hands, but he smoothly stepped aside with an agility that belied his age. "Do not test my patience, Elaine," Harrison warned, his tone dangerously low. "My legal team is already filing the fraud charges. If you leave this property right now, I will ask them to give you a 24-hour head start before they pursue the embezzlement investigation we've been building against you."
Elaine gasped, her eyes darting between my unyielding uncle and the sheriff, whose hand now rested sternly on his duty belt. She knew she was cornered. The intricate web of lies she had spun since my father's health began to decline had been entirely dismantled in less than 10 minutes. "Fine," she spat, all traces of the grieving widow evaporating.
Her face twisted into a mask of pure resentment. "I'll pack my things." "You will pack nothing," Harrison corrected her smoothly. "Your personal belongings were boxed up by my associates an hour ago and are currently waiting for you at a storage unit in town. The keys are on the hood of your car."
"You are to leave this property immediately, and if you ever set foot on this ranch again, Sheriff Davis will arrest you for trespassing." Defeated and humiliated, Elaine turned on her heel. I watched in stunned silence as she marched toward her luxury sedan, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled. As she sped down the gravel driveway, a massive weight lifted from my chest.
Once the dust settled and the sheriff had driven away, the sprawling lawn felt impossibly quiet again. Uncle Harrison dismissed his helicopter pilot, instructing him to wait in town, and slowly walked up the porch steps toward me. Up close, the resemblance to my father was heartbreaking.
The same strong jawline, the same deep wrinkles etched around the eyes from years spent squinting against the harsh Texas sun. "I am so sorry I didn't get here sooner, Clara," he said gently, his booming voice softening into a comforting rumble. I couldn't hold it back anymore. The adrenaline faded, and I collapsed into his arms, sobbing uncontrollably into his expensive suit. He held me tightly, patting my back just like Dad used to do when I scraped my knees as a little girl. When my tears finally slowed, I pulled back, wiping my eyes. Why didn't Dad tell me? Why did he keep your reconciliation a secret? He let me believe he was facing everything alone." Harrison sighed, looking out over the rolling pastures.
"Because your father knew how manipulative Elaine was, and he didn't want to put you in the crossfire. When he realized she was snooping through his files, he called me. We set up the trust in total secrecy to ensure your future was bulletproof. He wanted you to just be his daughter, not his bodyguard." My heart ached with a mixture of immense gratitude and deep sorrow.
Even as his heart was failing, my father had been working tirelessly to protect me. He had borne the emotional burden of Elaine's deceit entirely on his own shoulders, sacrificing his own peace of mind so that I could keep my childhood home. We moved inside, the familiar warmth of the ranch house wrapping around me like a blanket. I poured us both a cup of black coffee in the kitchen, taking comfort in the mundane routine. We sat at the large oak dining table, the very place where my father and I had shared countless breakfasts. "There's more you need to understand, Clara," Harrison said, wrapping his large hands around the mug. "This isn't just about the house and the cattle, it's about the oil." I nodded slowly. Dad mentioned a month ago that the surveyors found something on the South Ridge, but he never gave me the details. Elaine brought it up on the porch. "It's not just a minor deposit," Harrison explained, his eyes turning serious. "It's one of the largest untapped reserves in the county." That's why Elaine accelerated her plans. The rights alone are worth tens of millions of dollars. Your father refused to sell out to the massive conglomerates. He wanted the land preserved, the drilling managed responsibly, and the profits used to secure the ranch's legacy. I stared at my reflection in the dark coffee. Tens of millions of dollars. It was a staggering, incomprehensible sum. No wonder Elaine had resorted to forgery. She had seen a golden ticket and tried to rip it out of my hands. "I don't know the first thing about managing oil rights, Uncle Harrison," I admitted, a wave of profound inadequacy washing over me. "I just know how to mend fences, balance the feed budget, and care for the horses. I'm just a rancher's daughter."
"You are your father's daughter," he corrected firmly. "And you won't do it alone. I'll teach you everything."
That evening, after Uncle Harrison retreated to the guest bedroom down the hall, I found myself sitting alone in my father's study. The room still smelled heavily of his cherry pipe tobacco and old paper. His reading glasses sat neatly folded on the desk, resting right beside a worn leather ledger. I gently placed his Stetson on the coat rack in the corner, where it belonged.
For the first time in 48 hours, the crushing panic of losing my home was gone, replaced by a deep, quiet mourning. I was safe, the ranch was safe, but the man who had made it all possible was truly gone. I opened the top drawer of his desk and found a sealed envelope with my name written in his familiar, slightly shaky handwriting. My breath caught in the throat as I carefully broke the seal. "My dearest Clara," the letter began, "if you are reading this, it means my stubborn heart finally gave out, and my brother kept his promise to look after you. Forgive me for the secrets. I needed you to remember me as a father, not as a man fighting a war in his own house. The land is yours now. Protect it, but let it protect you too. I love you, always." Tears fell freely onto the parchment, blurring the ink. I pressed the letter to my chest, letting the grief wash over me completely. But beneath the profound sorrow, a new, resilient strength began to take root. Elaine had tried to break me, to steal my heritage and my memories. But she had failed. I was Clara, the guardian of this 5,000-acre legacy, and tomorrow I had a ranch to run. The sun had barely breached the horizon, painting the Texas sky in bruised shades of purple and gold, but I was already out in the stables. The familiar rhythm of mucking stalls and hauling feed was the only thing keeping me grounded. For a few precious hours each morning, surrounded by the warm breath and soft nickers of the quarter horses, I could pretend everything was exactly the same. But the illusion shattered the moment I walked back to the main house. Uncle Harrison had transformed my father's rustic dining room into a corporate war room. Blueprints, financial spreadsheets, and legal pads covered every inch of the scarred oak table. He sat at the head of it, a Bluetooth earpiece glowing quietly as he fired off rapid, jargon-filled instructions to someone in Dallas.
"Clara," he said, tapping a pen against a thick binder as he ended his call. "I've been reviewing the ranch's operational budget. Your father was running this place on sheer willpower and outdated methods. We are hemorrhaging money on the northern pastures. We need to liquidate the older cattle and restructure the feed contracts immediately."
I froze, the scent of hay and dust suddenly feeling entirely out of place in my own home. Liquidate? Uncle Harrison, those are the heritage breeds. Dad spent 20 years cultivating that specific bloodline. We don't just sell them off to balance a spreadsheet. "This isn't about sentimentality, Clara. It's about survival," he replied, his tone perfectly even, perfectly cold.
"The oil revenue won't flow for another 18 months. Until then, the ranch must carry its own weight. We have to make the hard choices my brother refused to make." His words stung, dismissing my father's life's work as mere inefficiency. The emotional chasm between us was already opening. Over the next 2 weeks, the ranch morphed into a bustling hub of strangers. Assessors, geological surveyors, and corporate lawyers swarmed the property, their shiny SUVs replacing the familiar, battered pickup trucks of our neighbors. I felt like a ghost haunting my own life, watching silently from the porch as my heritage was measured, quantified, and debated.
The hardest blow came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was walking back from the lower creek when I saw a pair of engineers tying neon orange flagging tape around the trunk of the massive live oak near the old tractor shed. It was the tree where Dad had hung my first tire swing, the tree under which my mother was buried before the county cemetery was built. I sprinted toward them, my heart hammering against my ribs. "What are you doing? Take that tape off right now!" I shouted, breathless and trembling. One of the men looked up, consulting a digital tablet. "Ma'am, Mr. Harrison authorized this route. It's the most efficient path for the heavy machinery to access the South Ridge oil site. The tree and the shed have to be cleared by Friday." "No!" The word tore from my throat. It wasn't just a tree. It was the anchor of my childhood. I stormed into the house, finding Harrison reviewing yet another contract. "You're tearing down the oak tree?" I demanded, tears of hot frustration spilling over my cheeks. "Is nothing sacred to you? Are you just going to pave over every memory I have of my parents for the sake of an access road?"
He didn't look up immediately. When he did, his blue eyes were shielded behind his reading glasses, revealing nothing. "Clara, it is just a tree. The logistics require it."
Dinner that evening was an exercise in agonizing silence. I pushed the roast beef around my plate, the silence of the large house pressing down on me. Since the argument over the oak tree, Harrison and I had barely exchanged 2 words. I felt utterly emotionally neglected, sidelined by the very man who had swooped in to save me. I realized with a sinking heart that Harrison didn't see me as an equal partner or the rightful heir to this land. He saw me as a grieving child who needed to be managed, just like the budget and the livestock. He was fixing a problem, entirely ignoring the human heart beating at the center of it.
"I called off the clearing crew," he finally said, breaking the silence without looking up from his tablet. "They will route the access road a 1/4 mile east. It will cost an additional $40,000 in grading, but the oak tree will remain." I looked up, stunned. "Thank you," I whispered, the anger deflating slightly, replaced by a confusing ache.
"Don't thank me," he replied curtly, closing the tablet with a sharp snap. It was an illogical financial concession, but I promised my brother I would look after you. If a piece of wood is what keeps you from falling apart, then the wood stays. He stood up and walked away, leaving me alone at the massive table. His words weren't comforting. They were a clinical assessment of my grief. He was tolerating my emotions, not validating them.
I buried my face in my hands, realizing that while Elaine had tried to steal the ranch legally, Harrison was inadvertently stripping away its soul. I had never felt more isolated.
The tension finally snapped a week later. I had spent the entire morning in the blazing heat trying to repair a broken water line in the western pasture because Harrison had fired our longtime ranch hand to trim the fat. I returned to the house covered in mud, grease, and exhaustion, only to find Harrison sitting on the porch with a stranger in a tailored suit.
"Clara," Harrison called out, his tone crisp. "This is Mr. Vance. He's going to take over the day-to-day operations of the livestock while we focus on the oil infrastructure. He has a degree in agribusiness." I stopped dead in my tracks. A stranger running my horses? Managing the herd I knew by name? The dam of suppressed emotion inside me finally broke.
"No," I said, my voice shaking with raw, unfiltered fury. "Absolutely not." "Clara, be reasonable," Harrison sighed, standing up. "You are overworked. You cannot manage this scale of operation alone." "I am not alone. I am the owner of this ranch," I screamed, the tears I had been fighting for weeks streaming freely down my dirt-smudged face. "You promised Dad you would teach me, not replace me. You're acting just like Elaine. She wanted the land for the money, and you want it for your ego. You don't care about this family. You only care about control." Mr. Vance awkwardly cleared his throat and stepped off the porch, retreating to his car. Harrison stood frozen, his jaw clenched tight. For a second, I thought he was going to yell, to use his booming voice to put me in my place. Instead, his shoulders slumped, the iron posture cracked, and the billionaire oil magnate suddenly looked like a very old, very tired man. The heavy silence stretched between us, broken only by the hum of Mr. Vance's car driving away. I stood there, panting, regretting my words the moment they left my mouth, but too hurt to take them back. Harrison slowly lowered himself into one of the rocking chairs, gripping the armrests so tightly his knuckles turned white. He took off his glasses, rubbing his face with a trembling hand. "You think this is about ego?" His voice was barely a whisper, stripped of all its corporate authority. "Clara, I haven't slept a full night since your father died. Every time I close my eyes, I see the brother I abandoned for 30 years because I was too stubborn to apologize." I froze, the anger draining out of me, replaced by a sudden, sharp clarity. "I wasn't here," Harrison continued, his voice breaking. A single tear escaped, charting a path down his weathered cheek. "I wasn't here when your mother passed. I wasn't here when his heart started failing. I left him to deal with Elaine alone. I am trying to optimize this ranch, to build this oil infrastructure, because it's the only thing I know how to do. If I can make this estate impenetrable, if I can make you so wealthy no one can ever hurt you again, then maybe I can forgive myself." My breath hitched. I had been so consumed by my own grief, so desperate to hold on to the past, that I hadn't realized Harrison was drowning in guilt. He wasn't trying to erase my father's memory. He was desperately trying to build a fortress around it. I walked up the wooden steps, my boots heavy, and knelt beside his chair. I gently placed my mud-stained hand over his trembling one. We were two broken people, trying to fix a tragedy from opposite ends. I stayed kneeling beside Uncle Harrison's chair on the porch as the Texas sun began its slow descent, casting long, golden shadows across the driveway. The silence between us was no longer suffocating. It was fragile, raw, and deeply human. Seeing the vulnerability in this powerful man fundamentally shifted my perspective. He wasn't the enemy trying to erase my father. He was a grieving brother trying to make amends the only way he knew how. "I need you to teach me, Uncle Harrison," I said softly, my voice steady despite the lingering tears. "But I need you to teach me how to be a partner, not an employee.
Dad didn't leave this ranch to a corporation. He left it to a family.
Harrison looked down at me, his sharp blue eyes softening with a mixture of sorrow and profound relief. He took a deep, shaky breath and squeezed my mud-caked hand. "You're right," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. "I came in here trying to fix a balance sheet.
I have been so terrified of failing my brother again that I ended up failing you. You haven't failed me," I reassured him, standing up and pulling another rocking chair close to his. "But we can't do this separately anymore. If we're going to protect this legacy, we have to do it together. No more secrets, no more unilateral decisions."
He nodded slowly, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through his stoic mask. "No more secrets. And Mr. Vance won't be returning. Tomorrow, you show me exactly why those heritage breeds are worth keeping."
The next morning felt like the first breath of fresh air I'd taken since the funeral. The oppressive corporate atmosphere in the dining room had dissolved. Instead of a war room, it became a classroom. Harrison sat beside me, rather than at the head of the table, patiently walking me through the complexities of the oil lease contracts and the trust's financial structures. It was overwhelming, but he never patronized me. Whenever I stumbled over the legal jargon, he broke it down, explaining how the clauses protected the land's water table from drilling runoff, a detail my father had fiercely negotiated. In the afternoon, the roles reversed. I took Harrison out to the lower pastures. I watched the billionaire oil tycoon, dressed in a borrowed flannel shirt and slightly too tight boots, awkwardly navigate the muddy terrain. I introduced him to the heritage course horses, explaining the 20 years of careful lineage and behavioral training my father had invested in them. "They aren't just livestock, Uncle Harrison," I said, leaning against the wooden fence as a mare nudged his hand. "They're a specialized commodity. Buyers pay a premium for this specific temperament. It's a long-term investment, not a quick turnaround." Harrison stroked the horse's mane, a look of quiet realization dawning on his face. "I see it now," he murmured. "I was only looking at the quarterly losses. I wasn't looking at the generational value. We keep the herd. We'll restructure the feed suppliers instead to cut costs." For the first time, we had reached a true compromise. The chasm between us was finally closing, bridged by mutual respect. Our newfound peace was abruptly shattered 3 days later by a certified letter from a prestigious Dallas law firm. I brought the envelope into the kitchen, my stomach twisting into a familiar knot of dread as I recognized the sender's name. Elaine wasn't finished with us. Harrison read the letter over his morning coffee, his jaw tightening so severely I thought his teeth might crack. "What is it?" I asked, gripping the edge of the kitchen counter. "I thought the trust was ironclad. You said she couldn't touch us." "She's changing her tactics," Harrison growled, throwing the letter onto the table. "She isn't contesting the forgery anymore. Now she's trying to invalidate the trust entirely." "Her lawyers are claiming that your father was experiencing severe cognitive decline 3 years ago. They are arguing he wasn't of sound mind when he signed the trust, making her the default heir as his surviving spouse." My heart plummeted into my boots. "But that's a lie. Dad was sharp as a tack until the very end. He beat me at chess 2 weeks before he died." "I know that, and you know that," Harrison said, rubbing his temples in frustration. "But Elaine has the money to drag this out in probate court for years, tying up the estate's funds. We need documented proof of his mental acuity during the time the trust was formed. Medical records alone might not be enough to stop a protracted legal war." The anxiety I thought I had banished returned with a vengeance. Elaine was like a shadow, determined to eclipse the life my father had built for me. I spent the entire afternoon frantically tearing through my father's study, searching for anything that could definitively prove his state of mind. Tax returns, handwritten letters, old calendars, everything was piled onto the rug, but nothing felt substantial enough to satisfy a judge facing Elaine's high-paid legal team. Exhausted and entirely overwhelmed, I collapsed onto the floor, staring blankly at the ceiling. My eyes traced the familiar crown molding, eventually landing on the small, square access panel leading to the attic. A vivid memory suddenly struck me. 2 years ago, I had caught my father coming down from the attic, covered in dust. He had brushed it off, claiming he was fixing a drafty vent. But Dad always hired handymen for roof work. He hated ladders. My pulse quickened. I grabbed a step stool, pushed open the panel, and hoisted myself into the suffocating heat of the attic. I crawled across the fiberglass insulation, aiming for the spot right above his study. Sure enough, one of the wooden floorboards was slightly misaligned. Prying it up with a screwdriver, I found a heavy, fireproof metal lockbox hidden in the joists. I hauled it downstairs to the kitchen, where Harrison was pacing. We broke the lock with a heavy hammer. Inside lay a stack of thick, leather-bound journals, meticulously dated. I opened the first one. It wasn't just a diary. It was a daily operational log of the ranch, detailing complex financial calculations, soil pH levels, and market predictions, all written in my father's steady, unmistakable handwriting. It was the undeniable work of a brilliant, completely lucid mind. Tears blurred my vision as I flipped to the very last journal, dated just a month before his passing. I handed it across the table to Harrison. He opened it carefully, his eyes scanning the final pages. I watched as his breath hitched, his composed exterior crumbling entirely. "Read it," I whispered, my voice thick with emotion. Harrison cleared his throat, his voice shaking violently.
"I know my heart is failing," he read aloud, a tear dropping onto the table. "But my mind is at peace. I have secured the land for Clara, and I have spoken with Harrison." Hearing his voice after 30 years was the greatest medicine I could have asked for.
Harrison closed the book and buried his face in his hands, weeping openly. I walked around the table and wrapped my arms tightly around his shoulders, crying with him. All the lingering guilt, all the unspoken apologies that had haunted my uncle for decades were finally washed away by my father's written words. These journals were our salvation.
They were absolute, legally binding proof of his competence, completely destroying Elaine's malicious lawsuit before it could even begin. But more importantly, they were a final gift from a father to his brother and daughter. We weren't just business partners fighting a legal battle anymore.
As we sat there holding on to each other in the quiet kitchen, I knew my father's true legacy wasn't the oil or the acres of land. It was the unbreakable family bond he had meticulously rebuilt before he left us.
The atmosphere in the downtown Dallas law office was as sterile and cold as Elaine's heart. Uncle Harrison and I sat on one side of a massive glass conference table, facing Elaine and her pair of high-priced attorneys. Elaine wore a tailored navy dress and an expression of supreme, unearned confidence. She refused to make eye contact with me, directing her haughty gaze only at my uncle. "Let's save everyone some billable hours, Harrison," her lead attorney began, adjusting his silk tie. "We are prepared to offer a settlement, 50% of the estate's liquid assets, and my client will drop the competency suit." Harrison didn't speak. Instead, he turned to me, offering a subtle, encouraging nod. This was my ranch, and it was my turn to protect it.
I unzipped my leather satchel and carefully placed the final volume of my father's journals onto the glass table. The heavy thump echoed loudly in the quiet room. "There will be no settlement," I said, my voice steady and clear, devoid of the panic that had ruled me weeks ago. This is my father's personal log, written up to the month he passed. It details his daily operations, complex financial projections, and his explicit reasons for creating the trust to protect this family from fraud. Elaine's smug expression faltered. Her lawyers leaned forward, their brows furrowing as I slid a notarized copy across the table. "I suggest you read page 42, I continued, looking directly into Elaine's widening eyes.
Where he explicitly outlines your attempts to access his accounts. If you proceed with this lawsuit, these journals will become public record. You won't just lose the case, you'll destroy whatever reputation you have left in this state.
The silence that descended upon the conference room was absolute. The lead attorney quickly scanned the copied pages, his professional composure cracking as he realized the sheer weight of the evidence. He closed the folder, turned to Elaine, and whispered something urgent into her ear. For the first time since my father's death, I saw Elaine completely devoid of artifice.
The fabricated grief, the arrogant entitlement, it all vanished, leaving only the hollow, bitter reality of a woman who had gambled everything and lost. "You planned this," she hissed at me, her voice trembling with suppressed rage. "You and your father, you played me for a fool." "No, Elaine," I replied softly, feeling a surprising wave of pity wash over me. "My father tried to love you."
But he wasn't blind. You made your choices the moment you decided his money was more valuable than his heart. We simply ensured the truth would outlive him. She stood up abruptly, her chair scraping harshly against the hardwood floor. Without a word to her lawyers, she grabbed her designer handbag and stormed out of the glass-walled room. I watched her figure disappear down the hallway, expecting to feel a rush of triumphant joy. Instead, I felt only a profound, quiet peace. The storm that had threatened to drown me since the funeral had finally broken. The shadow she had cast over my childhood home was gone. Harrison placed a warm, reassuring hand on my shoulder as the attorneys awkwardly gathered their briefcases to leave. We had won, not through malice or vengeance, but through the enduring, protective love of a father who had reached out from beyond the grave to shield us one last time. With the legal threats entirely neutralized, the real work began. Returning to the ranch felt different now. The air was lighter, the burden of anxiety replaced by the weight of genuine responsibility. It was time to integrate the past with the future. The day the drilling crews arrived to break ground on the South Ridge, I stood beside Uncle Harrison at the edge of the pasture. The massive yellow machinery roared to life, a stark contrast to the quiet rustling of the pecan trees. "Are you all right, Clara?" Harrison asked over the rumble of diesel engines. He watched me carefully, knowing how deeply I cherished the untouched beauty of the land. "I am," I answered honestly, and I was. We had spent weeks negotiating the environmental protections. The drill sites were pushed back to avoid the natural aquifers, and a significant portion of the initial oil revenue was dedicated to a land conservation fund in my father's name. Dad knew this was coming, I reminded him, watching the engineers set up their perimeter. He knew the oil could either destroy the ranch or save it. He chose to save it, and he trusted us to manage the scars. Harrison smiled, adjusting his hard hat. He chose well. The corporate board in Dallas is still shocked you forced them to adopt the water recycling mandate. You have a sharper negotiating bite than I do, Clara. I learned from the best, I nudged him playfully. We stood side by side, watching the transformation of our heritage. It wasn't the end of the ranch. It was its evolution. We were ensuring that this land would remain in our family for another 4 generations, protected by the very earth beneath our boots. As the oil infrastructure slowly took shape on the horizon, I focused my energy on the heart of the ranch, the horses. I wanted to prove to Harrison and to myself that the livestock wasn't just a sentimental drain on our resources. Instead of silently continuing my father's breeding program, I organized an exhibition. I invited elite buyers, ranchers, and equestrian competitors from across the state to our property. For a month, I worked from dawn until dusk, grooming, training, and preparing our finest quarter horses. When the day arrived, the ranch was buzzing with positive, vibrant energy. The sun shone brightly as buyers evaluated the magnificent animals. I stood in the center of the ring,
a microphone in hand, passionately detailing the lineage, temperament, and specialized training of each horse. I wasn't just a grieving daughter anymore. I was a businesswoman, a proud rancher showcasing her life's work. Harrison watched from the bleachers, his arms crossed over his chest, beaming with undisguised pride. By the end of the afternoon, the results were staggering. We had secured contracts that entirely covered the ranch's operational budget for the next 3 years without selling off the core breeding stock. As the last trailer pulled out of the driveway, Harrison walked up to me and tipped his hat. I stand corrected, Clara. The spreadsheets didn't capture the magic. You didn't just save the herd, you elevated the entire brand. We did it, I corrected him, wiping a smudge of dust from my cheek. We gave them a reason to believe in this ranch's future. The mutual respect between us had blossomed into a formidable partnership. Autumn arrived, painting the Texas plains in vibrant strokes of copper and gold. 6 months had passed since my father's funeral, and the transformation of the ranch and of myself was profound. The oil pumps rhythmically nodded in the distance, silently securing our financial future, while the main pastures remained untouched, filled with grazing horses. Late one afternoon, I saddled up my father's favorite gelding, a gentle giant named Chief, and invited Harrison to ride out with me to the western ridge. It was the highest point on the property, offering a panoramic view of the entire 5,000-acre estate. We rode in comfortable silence, the only sounds the rhythmic thud of hooves and the rustling wind. When we reached the crest, we stopped, watching the sky ignite with the brilliant hues of a Texas sunset. "He would be so proud of you, Clara," Harrison said softly, breaking the quiet. He looked out over the land, his eyes reflecting the golden light. "You took a broken situation and forged a masterpiece." "I couldn't have done it without you, Uncle Harrison," I replied, looking over at him. The man who had arrived in a black helicopter as a terrifying, authoritative executor had become my closest confidant, my mentor, and my family. "We healed each other," he murmured, patting his horse's neck. He knew we needed to be brought together. That was his real final act. I nodded, feeling a warm tear trace down my cheek, not of sorrow, but of profound gratitude. We sat on the ridge until the sun dipped below the horizon, silently promising the stars that this legacy, built on love and forgiveness, would never be broken again. As winter approached, the first royalties from the oil lease arrived. The sum deposited into the trust was staggering, far more than we needed to comfortably run the ranch for a lifetime. I sat in my father's study with Uncle Harrison, staring at the bank statement on the laptop screen. The sheer magnitude of the number felt heavy, a stark reminder of the corporate world that had almost consumed us. "We need to do something meaningful with this, Uncle Harrison," I said, leaning back in my father's leather chair. Dad never cared about hoarding wealth. He cared about the land and the community. Harrison nodded, taking off his reading glasses. "I agree completely." "What did you have in mind, Clara?" "I want to start a foundation," I explained, the idea crystallizing in my mind. There are dozens of family-owned ranches in this county struggling to survive against corporate buyouts, just like we almost did. We can offer them grants to modernize their operations, legal counsel to protect their deeds, and agricultural scholarships for their kids. Harrison's eyes lit up with genuine admiration. A defense fund for the independent rancher. We can call it the Arthur Estate Foundation, after your father. We spent the rest of the evening drafting the initial framework. For the first time, the massive wealth didn't feel like a burden or a target on my back. It felt like a powerful tool for good. My father had fought so hard to protect our 5,000 acres, and now, through his sacrifice and Uncle Harrison's business acumen, we were going to protect the entire county. The true test of my emotional resilience came on Thanksgiving Day. It was our first major holiday without Dad, and the house felt noticeably hollow without his booming laughter and the smell of his cherry pipe tobacco. I spent the morning in the kitchen,
aggressively rolling out dough for his favorite pecan pie, trying to keep my mind occupied and the tears at bay. Uncle Harrison walked in, wearing a casual sweater instead of his usual tailored suits. He quietly picked up a paring knife and started peeling the apples I had left on the counter. We worked side by side in a comfortable, companionable silence, a far cry from the bitter tension that had defined our early days together. When we finally sat down at the large oak dining table, the empty chair at the head of the table drew all the air out of the room. I stared at it, a heavy lump forming in my throat. Harrison gently reached out and placed his hand over mine. "He should be here, Clara. It isn't fair that he's not." "I miss him so much it physically hurts," I admitted, a single tear escaping my eye. "I know," Harrison whispered, his own eyes shining with unshed tears. "But look at what he left behind. Look at this home. We are sitting here together because he loved us enough to build a bridge we couldn't build ourselves." I wiped my eyes and smiled softly. We raised our water glasses to the empty chair. We were mourning, yes, but we were mourning together. The loneliness that had threatened to break me months ago had been entirely replaced by the quiet, enduring warmth of family. Late that night, long after the dishes were cleared and Harrison had gone to bed, I retreated to the attic. I crawled across the fiberglass insulation until I reached the loose floorboard above the study. I pulled out the heavy, fireproof lockbox where I had found my father's journals. I didn't open it to read his words this time. I opened it to add my own. I took out a piece of thick parchment and a pen, taking a deep breath before I began to write. "Dad," I wrote, my handwriting steady. "We did it. The ranch is safe and the horses are thriving. The oil rigs are running quietly on the South Ridge, and we made sure the runoff won't touch the creek. But more importantly, Harrison and I found our way to each other. You were right about him." Beneath all that armor, he is a good man who just needed his family back. I paused, looking around the dusty attic, feeling an overwhelming sense of peace. "I used to be so angry that you left me to face this alone, but I see now that you never did. You gave me the exact tools, the exact strength, and the exact partner I needed to survive. I am not just a rancher's grieving daughter anymore. I am the guardian of our legacy." I folded the letter carefully, slipped it into the lockbox next to his final journal, and clicked the heavy padlock shut. It was a symbolic closure. I wasn't leaving him behind, but I was finally ready to step out of his shadow and walk forward on my own 2 feet. By the time spring rolled around again, the Arthur Estate Foundation was fully operational. We hosted our first agricultural workshop right here on the ranch. Over 50 local high school students and struggling farmers arrived, eager to learn about sustainable livestock management and modern financial planning. I stood in the center of the main barn, holding a microphone, surrounded by the heritage quarter horses. I looked out at the sea of faces, seeing the same anxiety and determination I had felt a year ago. Ranching isn't just about hard work. I projected my voice clearly, feeling a deep well of confidence. It's about adapting. You have to honor the dirt beneath your boots while understanding the spreadsheets that keep it yours. Today, we are going to teach you how to do both. From the back of the barn, Uncle Harrison gave me a proud thumbs up. He took over the second half of the seminar, patiently explaining trust laws, asset protection, and contract negotiations to a mesmerized audience. Watching him patiently mentor the younger generation, I realized the full circle of our journey. Harrison had come to the ranch to dictate and control, driven by guilt. Now he was teaching and nurturing, driven by a profound sense of purpose. As a young girl approached me after the seminar, asking nervously about veterinary care for her family's small herd, I knelt down and walked her through the basics. Passing on my father's knowledge felt like keeping a part of his soul alive, planting seeds that would grow long after we were gone. Exactly 1 year after my father's passing, I woke up before dawn.
I dressed quietly, grabbed his weathered Stetson from the coat rack, and walked out onto the wraparound porch. The Texas sky was bleeding from indigo into a brilliant, fiery orange. The ranch stretched out before me, vast, beautiful, and utterly secure. The soft nickers of the horses drifted up from the stables, and the faint, rhythmic hum of the oil pumps hummed from the distant ridge. Uncle Harrison pushed open the screen door, holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He handed one to me, his silver-tipped cane resting gently against the porch railing.
The deep stress lines that had once carved his face had smoothed out, replaced by a quiet contentment. "It's a beautiful morning, Clara," he said softly, looking out over the rolling pastures. "It is," I agreed, wrapping my hands around the warm mug. I looked down at the Stetson in my hands. A year ago, holding this hat had felt like clutching a life preserver in a violently churning ocean.
Today, it was simply a cherished memory. Elaine, the betrayal, the crushing fear, it all felt like a distant nightmare that had washed away with the morning tide. I placed the Stetson on my head, adjusting the brim just the way Dad used to. "Ready for the day?" Harrison asked, an easy smile on his face. "Always," I replied. We stood shoulder to shoulder on the porch as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting a warm, golden light over the 5,000 acres of our family's unbroken legacy. The storm had passed, the roots were deep, and the future was entirely ours.